What's the most up thing you've ever did, Saw? I saw my little brother getting hit by a car and flying a few meters through the air when he was only 6 years old. Fortunately, he didn't even break a bone, but damn, I'll never forget this. I saw a couple guys try to dart through busy backed up traffic. A couple cars ahead of me. My brain thought it was one guy who threw his duffel bag in front of a car at first. Couldn't make sense of it being the faster one just getting ragdolled. Ed me up pretty good for a few hours. I could see the blood stain on the road for weeks afterwards. Apparently he made it. Weirdly, I saw a guy get shot to death in a parking lot last year and it wasn't as bad. More distance, I guess, and I didn't run over to the scene to see if I could help. I'm with you in this one, except my little brother didn't go flying. He got Ed under the car and saw him go under the wheel. It only happened 6 months ago and I still get nightmares over it. He broke his arm, collarbone, and pelvis. Good gash on his head and hip. When the lady finally stopped, I freaked out at first, running to the Burger King we were going to. It was his 10th birthday. I had no phone to call anyone and came back and dove under to him and held his head while talking to him. It was the worst thing I ever saw and call him a bad. His first words when I looked under the car were, "Amy, I'm alive." That calmed me down and made me jump straight into keeping him calm. Had him signing Red Hot Chili Peppers, by the way, when they went to lift the car. Had a full-on panic attack when the fireman told me to move away. And saw some lady with her phone out as if to take a video. I gave her this mad look when I was trying to catch my breath and she quickly put her phone away and walked away. Makes me feel sick that people do that, clearly see an accident had happened, and they take out their phones to record it without a care in the world for the victim or families. Sorry this reply went on a little bit longer than expected. What a messed up day. He is fine now, walking and jumping around like a normal 10-year-old with some badass scars he's proud of. A warrior. So glad your little brother didn't break any bones. Hope he is doing well nowadays and not too nervous on the roads. Hope you are okay. It's awful witnessing something like that. Does he have any lifelong injuries due to this, such as soft tissue damage or unexplainable pain? I was a bit older, around 12-13, but I was your brother once. Hit by a truck directly on my right shoulder. I flew, my shoes came off, only surface injuries and a minor concussion. Until I was 21, when my arm locked up out of nowhere, and 12 years later they still think it was from that accident when I was 12. They think they missed the waking up with the occasional stiff neck and tilt that developed and ignored was the cause. Because the or urgent care techs won't be looking at soft tissue as much on a child, I guess. Or maybe I just suffered severe medial neglect. I don't know. I was never even taken in the ambulance to the ER because I was walking. Sorry to get a bit off track. My question to you is he fine now, or does he have issues that developed later on in life that can be tied to that incident? I'm so sorry you had to witness that. I've never seen someone get hit and fly. I can only imagine the horror that must have been. Saw an elderly man step into traffic. He flew, then slid. Then he tried to stand up on his shattered legs. He struggled for a couple minutes while I tried to do first aid with nothing because I was jogging. He passed before the ambulance arrived. The kid that was driving the car was in shock. The girl with him kept whispering, "Not a good first date, not a good first date." I had a similar experience, except the outcome was much different. I saw a pair of little girls about 10 and 6 years old get hit by a car going about 40 miles per hour. The older girl was able to walk away limping after she was spun in the air upon impact. Her little sister, I assume, was hit head-on and was sent flying about 20 feet in the air and landed about 40 feet away. She unfortunately passed away. I can't imagine what her sister or the person that hit them felt or feels today, as it was a completely preventable accident. It was dark outside about 8:30 p.m. The little girls walked through a red light as they headed to the corner store with no adult in sight. I was a teenager at the time, and I still vividly remember this over a decade later. My brother made me spot for him so he could skateboard down our driveway and into the street. We lived on a dead-end street, so the risk was low, but even though I was 6, I knew it made sense to spot for him. For a while, he kept saying one more, and I kept watching for one more, and then finally got sick of it and told him I was done and walked away. He went for one more anyway, and I turned around at the top of the driveway and looked back in time to see him get hit by Mr. Hutchinson and his station wagon. He got hit by the front corner of the car, and the GIF that still plays in my head is of him doing somersaults alongside the car as Mr. Hutchison screeched to a halt. He was fine, but if he'd been another foot out in the street, he would have been run completely over. But then, this is the brother who went through a barbed wire fence face first on a sled at age 3 and got stitches across his eyelid without damaging his eye, pole vaulted himself on his ski pole with the pointy end in the belly somehow, 2 concussions in Pee-wee football. Found a bullet with a friend when they were 8, taking turns hitting it with a hammer until it shot him in the knee, totaled his MG, etc., etc., etc. Last week, he got a clean scan, seems to have beat cancer. Dude's got luck on his side, or does he? Found a dead body on the sidewalk in front of my building on my 3rd day living in NYC. When I told my supervisor about it at work, hoping to process it with someone, she just kind of brushed it off like, "Welcome to New York. Lived in Detroit until I was 20. When I was a really little kid, my dad told me how there was a dead body that got pulled out of the house across the street from me. Squatter, as the house was vacant. Just a normal thing. Unusual they found him before decay and decomposition though. Not a full skeleton, but the smells are there. Once was urban exploring in a particularly wide neighborhood with a buddy, and we got into a nicer looking big house, overgrown up front but bushwhacked in the back, like someone was stealth living there at some point, but not anymore. We get through the back room, which felt like a dining nook, through the kitchen and up some stairs so we could find the bedrooms, but the first room we go in up top, there was a body. Didn't get a good look at it. We said nothing, took nothing, and left the house respectfully. It's Detroit, so since police response for a dead body is the same as for a robbery, we just left him in his resting place. On the flip side of that, I'm a really big hiker. At one point I was hiking on a mountain with some friends in icy, wintry conditions, and we found a man who just passed. One of my friends was a nurse, so I helped her check his vitals while one of our friends tried to secure a strong enough cell signal to tell 911. It took search and rescue nearly 12 hours to get him down. He was by himself, didn't have any ID on him, just had a dead cell phone and a locked car in the parking lot that was probably his. The cops were trying to figure out who he was still by the time we left a couple hours later. The next day at work, I guess I looked a little off. A different manager saw me and asked what was wrong, and I kind of tried to play it off and told him I'd found a dead body in the woods the day before. On the one hand, he told my supervisor, who was advised by others, that it would be a good idea to send me home. On the other hand, word spread after that, and from then on, I became known as the person who found a dead body in the woods, to the point to where that was the story told at my send-off a couple years later when I was leaving that job. A kid I went to high school with was Ed when a guy on a motorcycle going at a high rate of speed hit his W-bug at the driver's door as he was coming out of a gas station. The guy I went to school with was Ed instantly, but the motorcyclist and the bike actually cut through the car and the roof and had to be cut out of the car. He lived for about 10 days before dying from his injuries. I saw this accident happen. About 6 to 7 years later, right off the same street, a guy on a Harley also going at a high rate of speed hit a Lincoln Continental in the rear, and he and the bike ended up in the middle of the car just behind the front seat. The guy on the bike was DOS, and the police and the ambulance couldn't free him, so they covered the car with a tarp and had to tow the car to a wrecking yard to get the dead guy and the bike extricated from the Lincoln. I didn't see this one happen, but a friend did, came and got me and told me, "You've got to see this accident." I got there before they covered the car and put it on the tow truck and watched as the FD hosed down the gas and all the blood. A neighbor was one of the cops on the scene and told me later where they took the car, the bike, and the dead guy. Both accidents were extremely gruesome. Reminds me when I was 3 years old. We heard a loud bang in the highway. A motorcycle had crashed with a Jeep and a tricycle. My grandpa went up to see it and also brought me along because he was supposed to be watching me, and I saw the person who was on the motorcycle lying dead on the ground. His skin was like gone on the side that he crashed, Atlee asked, the parts that slitted through the concrete, and you can actually see his brains, I think, or maybe it wasn't his brains, but Atlee asked you can maybe see his skull. I can't remember much since it was years ago, so some details may be off, but I know the skin thing was true because I vividly remember how it looked like the flesh turned into bloody fur or something. That's gnar. I worked at a restaurant in the downtown area of the city I live in. This day I got work early. Long story short, as I walk up to the corner across from the park structure my car was in, I heard a loud bang and car screeching. Some dude committed suicide from the 7th floor of the parking structure. He bounced off a parked car and rolled off into the main one-way downtown street. This was summer, so everyone was going to pool parties at hotels and whatnot. It was crazy because someone in traffic was an actual nurse or DR and was trying to handle it until the paramedics showed up. Me and a ton of other people watched either praying or just frozen in horror as this guy's head just gushed blood slowly. I've never seen so much blood in my life besides a movie. On election day, Trump v. Clinton, I was making a sandwich and the back door leading to the garage was open. 2016 was a head-up year. I lost the most important woman a man could use, and a few months later I saw the Cubs win it all. Anyway, my dad was in the back, and I hear gunshots. I was too scared to go look. Anyway, I went out and I see a black man 20 feet away on the floor rolling in pain. Paramedics arrive, well, they just place a sheet over him. Detectives come through my garage, which was open, and ask me and my dad if we saw anything. I didn't see anything. My theory, I live in a segregated all-Hispanic gang-infested area. This black guy probably mugged the wrong guy, and that was that. A couple gang members also came up to me and asked if saw or heard anything, and I said nah, I was making a sandwich. And I came out like 5 minutes later. That's kinda the most ed-up thing I've seen in person. Online, I accidentally saw a guy's sweater get caught on a machine and then his whole body got ed in and dude's body went in circles until everything exploded. I think this was in Russian. I clicked a video not expecting that. I tend not to watch gore videos online. Worked in a gas station in ADEs. Some guy came in after midnight and bought a cigarette lighter. He walked outside and went over to one of the gas pumps and pumped gas all over himself. Set himself on fire after that. After I tripped, the emergency shut off for the pumps me, and another customer ran outside. The customer tried to put the fire out on the guy with his jacket, and I used a fire extinguisher on the other things that was on fire. Eventually we succeed, but the guy was seriously burned all over. This was the 80s, so most of his clothes was of synthetic fabric that had melted into his flesh. His face was kind of melted too. The ambulance came really quick and he was taken away. He didn't die, but I never saw him again. I talked to some cops a while later and they said that he was on probation and was protesting about his treatment and tried to commit suicide. My coworker just saw a man get hit by a car. She said it was as if the car that hit him exploded like in the movies and car parts went everywhere. The guy's one shoe and glove flew off and he was flown far from where he was actually hit. She checked the guy's pulse, he was obviously gone. Said he had a pool of blood just flowing out of his head. She said while talking to the cops or EMTs and whatnot she was totally fine talking and answering questions. After everything was gone she got back in her car, and as she was driving away she let out the longest, most blood-curdling scream and became hysteric. She could barely tell her husband what happened when she got home because she was so hysterical. She said she's never been in shock before, but now that she knows what it's like, it is a crazy emotion. My mother's reaction and acts of grief, screaming, crying, shouting, and finger-pointing in my early years shook and scared and upset me more than the deaths that were also really strong emotional times for me. I'll never forget her moan and little cry of no when her dad's coffin started having the curtains drawn around it for the cremation. It made me feel scared and alone and so upset for her and myself. She later got upset to anger days later at her mom for not crying at the cremation. Like me at the time, I didn't cry, but my mom was hellbent thinking because she didn't cry at the time she didn't care. I loved my grandpa very, very much and miss him dearly, but I remember more of the funeral and the days around it than him, despite being a big part of my life for my first 12 years, which is kinda depressing. Fatal hit-and-run vehicle accident that happened in front of me. A car got struck by someone who ran a red light. The truck at fault basically slowed down a second and then drove away. I stopped to check on the people in the car. It was a couple of teens. The guy having substantial leg injuries and the girl was unconscious and losing a lot of blood. Like, her pants, seat, and floor carpet were becoming saturated with it. She basically stopped breathing and lost her pulse before the ambulance got there. The guy was crying and begging for me to help her, though there wasn't much I could do. Once she was loaded on the ambulance, the guy started pacing around on his bad leg and basically having a panic attack. The ambulance crew and some firefighters were mostly busy with the girl, so me and one other firefighter were trying to calm the guy down. He finally collapsed in pain and another ambulance arrived to get him taken care of. I remember getting in my car to drive home, turning the radio off, having a "what the just happened" moment, then driving home in silence while trying to process it. Didn't get much sleep that night, obviously. I later learned that they never got her pulse back. She was either 15 or 16 years old. Don't remember exactly. I was sitting at a light waiting for green, and when it turned I started to take off but noticed a car going way too fast to stop, so I stopped and somehow got the attention of a car full of kids next to me and got them to stop. They thought I was trying to start and were kinda giving me. And then bam, he hit someone coming the other direction. There was a cop that I could see parked maybe a half-mile away, so I went down there and told them. The mucked up thing was two cops in a single car. It was a rough side of town. Were flirting with some woman and blew me off even though I said it was a major accident with probable casualties. I turned around and went to see if I could help. Cops didn't show till maybe 7 minutes later. The kids were still there. They thanked me and apologized for getting Thai. I'm just glad they noticed me. A couple weeks later there was a memorial on the telephone pole at the intersection. I'm sorry you went through that. I witnessed something similar but not as close up involved. A fatality as the result of a police chase. The police had stopped chasing at that point, but we were the third car waiting to turn out of a parking lot as the speeding car came over a blind crest on a 5-lane road. It T-boned the first car on the driver's side as they tried to turn left. The car was pushed back or spun towards us, nearly hitting the second car. The passenger of the second car, directly in front of us, got out pretty quickly to check on them. And I'll never forget the look on her face when she very quickly turned around and began shaking her head. It was clearly bad and she looked like she might pass out. The police were there a few seconds later and immediately directed our cars to get us moving, but we drove right past the vehicle that was hit, and I'm glad I only saw a small partial glimpse. One night I was driving home from my girlfriend's place and I got to this one traffic light which was green for me. I'm over the line when all of a sudden this guy on a bike with a passenger screamed through the red light, probably 5 meters in front of me. This was a 80 km/h zone and they were probably going in excess of 130 km/h. I hit my brakes so hard, got angry, then realized someone almost ed themselves and someone else most probably because they didn't want to slow down. In South Africa we have load shedding, and it's always dangerous to drive during it. Large intersections become 4-way stops, but some people don't get the memo. I've nearly been hit 4 or 5 times because of it. My sister and I saw a bad accident when we were kids. A guy who was drunk hit the ditch, and somehow his car was launched up and clear over a bison fence before rolling a number of times. My dad told me not to look, and he ran and climbed the fence to check on him. He had died. There was a woman and man who was following behind his car, who pulled over a minute or two after it happened. Apparently, the woman had insisted on going to pick up her husband because she didn't trust his friend not to drive drunk. She was wailing because she was so frightened that her husband was almost in the car that crashed. It's not the image of the wreck that stays in my mind. I luckily didn't see any human remains. It's the sound of her screams. Oh, you just knocked loose a memory for me. Was maybe 2004 or 2005, Eastern Utah, and some lady on vacation with her husband and 5 kids from Texas. My parents and I were the first vehicle upon the situation. Bloody ragdoll lady unconscious in the middle of the road. Husband and oldest kid are outside the minivan freaking out. My dad, being no stranger to medical emergencies due to work, jumps into action right away to try and stabilize the lady. While he was doing that, we were trying to get cell phone service to call 911 to report that a lady had fallen out of a vehicle traveling 55 miles per hour, which was hard enough being in a canyon. Can't say I remember ever talking to a 911 operator, but I remember hearing the guttural moaning and screaming of the lady as she regained consciousness. They ended up having to fight for life her out to Salt Lake City. Oh, and based off of what the state patrolman had preliminarily found with the lady falling out of the vehicle, it wasn't an accident. She wanted to transfer her inner pain to her husband and 5 children by ing herself in front of them all on vacation. Bad car accidents are horrifying. I came across a head-on collision on Hawaii 1 a few years ago. There was only a single HEP on scene, so I got out to see if I could help. Cop told me to hold C-spine on the driver, and as I'm trying to hold this guy's head straight, he starts freaking out and screaming, "How's my wife? How's my wife?" And for first time, I look down and see the whole front dash is caved in, trapping the driver's legs, and it's way worse on passenger side with only like an arm that I can see. By this point, I start getting full body tremor, which is not ideal for my assigned task. I try to say something like, it's okay, but thankfully multiple ambulances are arriving at this point, followed by life flight paramedics, and they don't need me anymore. I never speed anymore and wonder why people buy sports cars. I worked for a horse training ranch for a month when I was a kid. Me and the dude I worked with found a cow that had been dead for a while out in the field. It was bloated and gonna blow soon. We did not engage with the cow. We weren't prepared for a cleanup that day. When we came back prepared for cleaning the next day, it had ruptured and the smell was life-changing. It was spiritually bad. Since I was basically an unpaid intern, the paid guys told me to take a hike. 14-year-old me took a hike. I was a hard-working kid and they knew it, so let me off with that one. I was working at a safari in South Africa a decade ago, and a farmer had donated one of his heifers who had died to us to feed to a pride of lions which were in a temporary enclosure. We decided to cut the carcass in two to allow all the members to feed well. But as the chainsaw split the cow, it became clear the reason she died was from two impacted stillborn calves who fluidly slid out onto the ground. The smell was cataclysmic for everyone in a 100 feet radius. It was like a spell from a fantasy book, where in an instant 15 people were retching, dry heaving, attempting to flee. It clung to everyone, their clothes, their nosmic memory. It was an act of violence. There's a special place in hell for baby childers. Until we had our daughter, I didn't really feel any differently about baby or child murders than adults. After seeing my daughter born and watching her grow over the last 2 years, I get pretty emotional now when I see news stories about ings involving little ones. I can't even fathom how anyone could be so up to harm a child, especially a newborn. It's even worse when the is the mother or father or both. They're so innocent and precious, and it's our duty to protect them from this Thai world. I remember reading an article a few months ago from Florida where a dad shot his 2 kids right after the mom tucked them in for bed. It brings tears to my eyes just thinking about it, and I'm not typically an emotional person. I just don't understand how someone can possess that amount of evil within them. I once stepped on a human's brain. There was a storm that day, so I did not pay attention to fallen trees and poles. And when I approached the bus stop and looked at the schedule, I suddenly stepped on something. I noticed it and understood that the pillar fell right on the man and crushed his skull. This bus stop is a little slanted, so blood and brain spread all over the pedestrian zone. The body, of course, was already in the ambulance car, but some traces still remained on the ground. When I was in EMT school, never finished it, my instructor told us a story about a call he got to a body laying on some train tracks. They get to the scene and realize it's just a passed-out drunk homeless guy. His upper body was off the tracks and only his ankles were on the tracks. They drag him off and sit him up and whatnot, and when they put a blanket over him, he starts rambling about his boots being missing. They try to tell him that they'll get his boots and to calm down, but he wouldn't let up. Instructor finally finds the boots in some bushes a bit ways away, but when he picks them up, the guy's feet were inside of them. He runs back over and lifts the blanket they put on the homeless man, and sure enough, there's just 2 stumps with dried blood where his feet used to be. Turns out a train had driven by while he was passed out and ran over his ankles. The heat and friction of the rails basically cauterized his wounds closed and prevented him from losing much blood. It was dark and the tracks were down in a little ravine off the side of the road, so they didn't even see or think to check his feet in the moment.